continued part of life.
Hey, congratulations, Trent.
When Tim Wilcox emailed me and asked that I consider introducing him today, I thought, well, I've known him for 55 years. We both have been very lucky in staying out of any major trouble. But I really needed to get a hold of a copy of his resume so that I could learn some of the principal and tellable aspects of my credit. I found the following quote. Mr. Wilcox has earned a reputation as the top Indiana private investigator in legal, corporate, insurance, and personal matters, which has resulted in countless personal appearances on local and national news programs. What he really left out was that his experience since the date of his acquisition of International Investigator King in 1970 has really been the true source of his ability to become so successful with the private investigator. Now, I will admit, despite the fact that he was known as, quote, ex-bad boy at North Central, he has been able to build his corporation into one of the most successful privately owned investigating firms in the Midwest. My God, what a great opportunity to introduce my friend Tim Wilcox. His email had a request, and I quote, "Be kind." All right, Tim. You are one of the best, and I'm proud to have called you a good friend for many, many years. A highly successful and respected private investigator, I introduce Mr. Steve Denham.
Jim, you really were kind to me. Trent, was it easier to get down there and Marge? Good to see all my Kiwanis buddies here. I don't know if I ought to just hold this in my hand, or I think I should. First time I talked to the Kiwanis Club, I think Jim Blythe asked me to do it, and it was 1986 or 87. It was at the Severn Hotel in the ballroom on the top floor of the Severn Hotel. And at that time, I brought the latest technology that we had, and it was a briefcase, big old satchel briefcase that had a hidden TV camera and a pinhole lens in it. And that was the best technology we had. So I kind of like to give you a contrast of the technology in the PI business since I bought the company in 1970. Now, give you a little history, and all you people who've been to the inner clubs, it's okay to go to sleep. You know, you've heard this story before. I bought the company in 1970 from Bert Servas, and at that time it was 10 years old. The company was started in 1960 by some ex-FBI agents, and it's finally leaked out over the years that the first 10 years the International Investigators was a CIA proprietary. And what that meant was that back in those days, the federal agencies could set up their own dummy corporations and have them do their dirty work, I guess. And if something bad happened, then they just say, we don't know a thing about it. Well, in 1970, President Nixon had an executive order making it illegal for the federal intelligence agencies to spy on Americans. They just do it a different way now. And I won't tell you anything about that. But I'd like to tell you what I kind of inherited in 1970 from the old regime. The first thing I had was a two-way mirror. And back then we ran a lot of polygraph tests, and the old organization did too. And polygraph had been around since maybe 1920 or so. And it was a fairly refined instrument for finding out if people are lying. So I inherited a two-way mirror. Also, our first client wanted us to conduct a surveillance on their sales manager. And this sales manager was suspected of working with a competitor. And so they said, I want you to follow them. And I had no experience at all in this business. So I tried to follow this guy, and the guy had a heavy foot, and I lost him like the first 3 or 4 days that I tried to follow him. So I went to our client, and I said, I've heard about a thing called a bumper beeper. I've seen it in a security magazine. So they fronted the money, and we bought a bumper beeper. So it was magnetic, and I stuck it underneath this guy's car, and they said, we think he's going to Richmond, Indiana. So I follow the guy from his house. I stay behind him. The range on this thing was maybe 4 or 5 blocks. And I follow him on Interstate 70 going to Richmond. Well, he goes past Richmond. He just keeps going. And fortunately, I had a full tank of gas, but when I started to run out, I filled up really quickly, and I got my car up to about 110 miles an hour, and I caught up with him, and I picked up the signal. And make a long story short, I followed him all the way to Newark, New Jersey. Now, if you remember in 1970, Newark, New Jersey was ashes, and it had all kinds of horrible riots and problems there. And so he went right to a factory in the middle of this terrible area, and it was the competitor. So that opened my eyes to what technology really was. And so I've always been kind of a toy freak, and so anything that came along, in the investigative field, I had to have it. And so the only other piece of equipment that I inherited from the old regime was a Uher reel-to-reel recorder. And it was made in Germany. It was the best recorder you can imagine. And so we used those types of devices for all kinds of things. Back when it was in the gray area on wiretap and things like that. And I got myself in a few jams, got in the fringes of Watergate, and my corporate counsel, Mr. Blythe, helped bail me out of that. It was a learning experience. And as a result of that, I became much more conservative. But about 1972, there was a device that was declassified by the CIA. It was called a PSE, Psychological Stress Evaluator. And this was a technology where you could actually run a lie detection test on somebody by their voice. So I immediately went to school. The cost of that unit was about $7,000, including the training. And in 1972, that was a lot of money. But I mustered it up, and I got that. And so by that time, I had hired a couple more employees. And so we were doing lots of lie detection tests overtly for people who were suspected of doing something, and also covertly for insurance companies and other people who wanted us just to find out the truth about something. Insurance claims. Insurance companies are always getting ripped off on fraudulent claims. So we would call up the insured, posing as a claims person, and ask them all the right questions and record it, either that or do it face-to-face or over the phone, and we could tell pretty much if they were telling us the truth or not. Now, that was just enough probable cause to get the insurance company to pursue the investigation a little further or just drop it. So one of the other things that we inherited was a big leather case of theft powder, a thief-type powder. One was a pigment stain, and the other one was a invisible powder that would just show up under a black light. And so one of the first cases we had that was going to be nearly impossible was at Western Electric. Remember the old Western Electric plant out on Shadeland? And this is a ridiculous investigation. I don't know if anybody here has ever been out to the Western Electric plant, but it was like huge, almost 1.5 million square feet. 90% of the employees were women, and they were all on assembly lines making telephones like, we don't have any telephones that are as good as the old Western Electric phones. And so they had restrooms out in the production area because it was so far to walk to go to any of the other restrooms. And one time, a lady was using the restroom and looked up, and there was a hole in the ceiling, and there was an eyeball looking through there. So they hired us to try to find out who did it, and to run a TV camera out there because it was a 24/7 operation would have been impossible. So I got this theft kit out, and we could see there where the dust had been moved up on top of this restroom, just a wooden restroom. So I poured a bunch of this powder around the eye hole. And the next day, one of the foremen was walking down the aisle, and the whole side of his face was bright blue. And so we knew right away who did it. And it was an easy way to get a confession because he didn't know it was on there. And so that technology worked pretty well. We also had a guy who had retired from the Indianapolis Police Department crime lab, and he was probably one of the best fingerprint experts there was. And so we hired him, and he did a lot of fingerprint lifting for us for all kinds of different investigations. So, and the only other thing that I inherited was a database. Now, in 1970, nobody ever heard of a database. What it was a huge card file that had over 300,000 3x5 cards. It was referred to back then as an indice file system. When the FBI finally went to computers, they had, I was told, at least 75 million 3x5 cards. And when they went to the IBM punch cards. Well, by the time we went computerized, we had almost 600,000 3x5 cards. And anytime we would take in an investigation, we'd make a 3x5 card for everybody involved in the investigation. Our client, the subjects of investigations, witnesses, and all that. File them alphabetically, so if somebody called us the next day and said that I want to investigate Jim Blythe, and we'd look through the B's and find if we ever did something on Jim Blythe, and then we'd go find that file. And so that was our database. Man, I'll tell you now, databases are just absolutely unbelievable. How many people here have never used Google? Tom, you're the only one that's never used Google? That's the most amazing database in the world. When I first got involved in this business, and I went through the training for the psychological stress evaluator, I met a guy who was training with me, and almost all of them were ex-CIA or military intelligence or people like that, and they all had phony companies that they were going to. I was the only one that was legitimate, or quasi-legitimate. One of the guys that was in the class with me was a captain on the Chicago Police Department, Tony Rossetti, who's one of the neatest guys I've ever met, and he was the personal security for Mayor Richard Daley, the original Mayor Daley. And so we struck up a pretty good friendship, and at the same time I purchased a lot of what they call sweep equipment, countermeasures equipment. A lot of it was declassified military or FBI or CIA sweep equipment. The whole kit weighed over 200 pounds. And so Tony Rossetti said he was wanting somebody who he could trust to do the sweeps for Mayor Daley. He knew I was a Republican. He knew I was from Indianapolis. He didn't trust anybody in Chicago, regardless of what party they were. Chicago's just a different place. And so off and on for about 4 years, I did all the sweeps for Mayor Daley. A lot of the aldermen, a lot of the ward chairmen, a lot of the Congress people there. It was quite an interesting experience. And I met the gentleman 15 or 20 times, been to his house a lot of times. He was just a down-to-earth guy as you'd ever want to meet. So that was a really interesting experience, and a lot of that equipment that I got was previously used by the other regime.